right now, as our game fires up, we can shoot a large stream of bullets. It's not working terribly well. We can shoot death. Death goes away. It's nice to be able to kill death. It's a satisfying experience. But at the moment, I have 100 bullets to work with. If we knock it down to a more manageable number and look at 10 bullets when I shoot, we'll notice that we're getting some interesting things going on. And it fires all 10 until it uses up the bullets. Last time we had next bullet, number of bullets. So we kept track of which is the next bullet I can use, and if the bullets were busy, they didn't refire. So we had that going on right now. So if a bullet is fired, it becomes busy until it wanders itself off screen, or until it hits the target, and then the bullet doesn't have to be busy anymore. Well, no, that's not in it, but that could be in it. Oh yeah, bullets are resetting. So the bullet resets somewhere. So then when the bullet hits death, it's no longer busy, or when the bullet wanders off of the stage, then the bullet no longer is busy, so that it resets itself and can be reused. But we have an unlimited firing mechanism. You pull the trigger and it launches all your bullets in one shot. That's not a very good gameplay experience. So we need to figure out a better way to go about doing that. And there's a variety of different techniques that we can use. The one that I'm going to recommend is we set up a timer. If we use a timer, the timer, every time you fire, it kicks off a timer, and it will prevent you from being able to fire again until the timer is done. And when the timer is done, then it allows us to be able to fire. So it becomes a handy way to control that firing experience. So the first thing that we'll need is our timer. I'm going to refer to it as my firing timer, because that allows me to have a name that makes sense, because we may have additional timers in your project down the road. You may have a countdown timer, so perhaps the game only runs for 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 30 seconds. So we have a countdown timer in addition to a firing timer. Now with my firing timer, I can add that into my setup. Firing timer is equal to a new timer, and we can decide what the firing interval is going to be, and this is something that will kind of depend on your sense of gameplay for what you want. So you'll decide, do you want the firing timer to be something that runs quickly so you can fire very rapidly? Do you want to really slow it down? And a good starting point is 1/3 of a second or thereabouts. So 300 milliseconds seems to be a nice kind of happy medium. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, and then you figure out what works better or best for you. So in addition to our firing timer, it's also useful to have a Boolean that is referred to as firing. And what this Boolean does is we initially set it to false, and the moment we hit the fire button, it sets firing to true and then starts that firing timer, and the firing timer is going to then be our countdown that we will need to have run until the firing timer can be reset to false. And as long as firing is true, that means we've pushed the button. That means we won't be able to shoot again until it's back to false. So it's a way that we can manage it. So we kind of create this state of we are firing, or kind of where the firing or the gun is busy, and then it's no longer busy, then we can now fire once again. So with that, we will want a Boolean. And it sounds way more complex than it actually is. When we see it, it makes more sense. Now, if you find that you're, we have a Boolean for fire, we have a Boolean for firing, and then we have our firing timer. If those names are too close to each other for you, you're welcome to come up with names that are more verbose or more words strung together so it's easier to keep things straight. These are just the ones that I've used often enough for enough years that they work for me. Instead of firing, you could say is firing. I mean, that's, or, you know, weapon is busy, or you can come up with any kind of naming scheme that works for you. And then we give firing an initial value of false. So we say, nope, we're not firing right now. Now, the cool part about this is that when it comes time to fire, so we're able to not launch a new bullet unless firing is false. So what we can say is if fire, meaning I press the space key or shift key or a letter key or whatever you have assigned to your firing key, and so if I press fire and I'm not currently firing, using the exclamation point, if you don't like that, you could say and firing is equal to false. So you could use, you know, whichever method works for you. I would encourage you get accustomed to using the exclamation point to represent the word not. So this says if fire is true and firing is false, or I'm not firing, so if fire and not firing, meaning I'm not currently shooting anything, then we can go and launch or make the next bullet become active. We tell the bullet to fire from the player's position, rotate to the player's rotational direction. And then after we've done all of that, then we can say firing is true and firing timer dot start. So we tell the firing timer to start. The good part about this is that will tell firing timer to start. Now, this is a good place to test your project, and you should find out if everything is working correctly. You can fire once and only once, and after that you can't fire again because we currently haven't put any way in here to set firing back to false, thus enabling you to launch the next bullet. So if I run this, I can fire one and no more. So it gives me the chance to fire one and only one time. Listening for the timer to be done is as simple as writing another conditional statement here. I'll put it up higher on screen so we can see. So if firing timer is finished, so if firing timer is finished, and it's not required, but we could write if firing timer is finished is equal to true. We don't have to write the equals to true. The same way that we can use a not statement or the true here. So it's not required, but sometimes you may like it just for ease of readability, so you remember, oh yes, that's a Boolean. And really, anytime you're doing a conditional, it's about a Boolean. You're asking, is something true or is something false? Even when you're comparing numbers, is this number bigger than this number? That's a true or false statement. Is this object on top of this object? It's a true or false statement. In this case, we're asking, is the firing timer finished? And if firing timer is finished, then we just say firing is equal to false. So that means we're no longer shooting anything, so we're ready to reset our weapon. And now testing it, we can see that it gives me a little better sensibility when I'm shooting here. Adding in multiple enemies, instead of using a single enemy, we're now going to use an array of enemies. So we reference it, the array is filled with the enemy object, we call it enemies. We'll also want to know how many enemies are currently active, and we need to know our total number of enemies that we'll put in our game. It's better to store that in a variable so you don't have to change that number if in multiple places if you change the number of enemies appearing in your game. So I give those values. Active enemy starts at 0, number of enemies starts at 10, then enemies is equal to new enemy, and it's an array filled with that many items. Simple for loop goes through and says, hey, number of enemies, as long as less than that, enemy's I is equal to a new enemy. So that now populates it. It's the same as what we did in the catcher game with the drops, that we're adding in a bunch of objects. We're looping through in the array to put them into what we're trying to do. Once we have all the objects created, then we use a for loop to tell each enemy within that array to update and display itself, to put that on screen. So to do that, I have my for loop that says, hey, if it's I is less than active enemy, so we'll start out with the first, and then it goes through and tells each enemy to update with the player's X and Y, and then it tells it to display. All collision detection has been grayed out or commented out right now. We'll deal with that momentarily. Currently, active enemies, when it's less than the number of enemies, it goes up. So that means after 10 frames, or a fraction of a second, all of my enemies are currently active. If I want to stage their appearance on screen, I would need to use a timer object and do it in the same manner that we used a timer to control the introduction of each one of the drops in the catcher game. So I could do that and put that in, but I'm not going to worry about that just yet. And once I do this, I have my enemies showing up on screen. One tweak I did do to the enemies is I made the enemies have a slightly random speeds. So they're always updating their speed. Every time they're changing direction, they are figuring out. So every frame, they're tweaking their speed. So they could go fast, they could go slow as we go between frames. So they don't, we can see that they're not all moving at the same rate. Some are faster, some are slower. Wanting to have the player intersect with death, right now I can just look at what was there before and put that into my project. Now, I could copy paste, but I'm just going to type it in. It's not so hard. So we're asking if an intersect has occurred with the player and the individual element, enemy's I, from the array. So if that intersect has occurred, at that point, I'm changing the tint color to affect the death unit. So a transparent blue. But if intersect has not occurred, then at that point, we'll set the tint back to untinted, which is solid white. So when we tint something with opaque white, it's the same as returning something to its natural color. Now, it probably would make sense sequentially, knowing that programming executes in line order. We update the position of the enemy, then we check for intersection, and then we tell the object to display. Otherwise, if we display the object before we do the tint, it could have some weird effects, though I think tint will override it, but it's still, we can see how it plays out. So we can see when one of the death objects is intersecting, and get the tint effect happening. So that now intersects one item to an array of objects. Currently the bullets update, but the bullets aren't intersecting the enemy yet. We need them to. And we'll end up using something along these lines. But currently this was for working with a single enemy, and we need to work with multiple enemies. And the way that we end up going through this is we do a loop inside of a loop. So currently I have my for loop with I, referencing my number of bullets. Now, what we can do is have a second loop, and with this one, and when we do a loop within a loop, we typically will start out with the letter I, the next time J, the next letter K. J is equal to active enemies, and then J plus plus. And what we'll be able to do then is, while we're cycling through this loop, so the first time we take the first bullet, we compare it against all of the enemies. Then we take the next bullet and compare it against all of the enemies. Then the next bullet and against all of the enemies. So that's how we end up doing our loop. Now this is what would be referred to as a brute force method. I'm comparing every enemy to every bullet. In a large-scale game where you have thousands of projectiles and thousands of enemies, this would not be a very efficient way of working, because we would have hit an exponentially outrageous amount of comparison. So we would have to have a better strategy. But for the limited scale of what we're doing, of say 10 to 10 or 100 to 100, it's not so bad. But we do need to change the word enemy here to be our array notation. So if we compare bullet I versus enemy J, and if they're intersecting, then we tell the bullet and the enemy to reset themselves. So then they go pop themselves somewhere to a new starting location. And by doing this, we can run it and run into an error message. So I screwed up with an equal sign. It was supposed to be a less than sign. It's pretty much, it should look just like this line, but with J and enemies instead of bullets. And now, if we run it again, this time we'll see that I can. And unfortunately, I mean, this is kind of hard because I can't fire that quickly. I can only fire in the direction that I'm pointing, making this a very 10 enemies didn't seem so bad until I can't fire fast enough to really kill them all. This is a pretty difficult game.